So this and my other factory, I can guarantee production of 200 kilos refined every month of the year. The problem is I have no steady market.
Scarface didn't just push violence and excess to the edge. It buried its most shocking details underneath layers of production chaos, improvisation, and real-world consequences that most viewers never notice. What looks like pure, stylized crime cinema on screen is actually built from accidents, unscripted moments, physical tolls on actors, and hidden decisions made under pressure. The story behind the camera, as it turns out, is often more extreme than what's on it. Once you start pulling those threads, you realize Scarface wasn't just made to shock audiences. It was built in a way that almost no one involved fully controlled. Today, we'll unveil 18 such hidden details that you completely missed in Scarface. Number 18. What was that white powder? On the surface, the harmful substance world of Scarface looked brutally real. But you didn't really think the actors were actually snorting controlled substances on screen? Well, as it turns out, the production used a mix of powdered milk and baby laxative to simulate the substance visually. It may seem strange, but it was chosen because it could be snorted on camera and still mimic the texture and flow of real harmful substance under studio lighting. During filming in 1982, Al Pacino performed dozens of takes involving repeated inhalation of this substitute, especially in sequences tied to Tony Montana's escalating addiction spiral. The physical toll built quietly. Powdered milk, when inhaled repeatedly, can irritate mucous membranes, and combined with the laxative base, it creates an abrasive compound that affects respiratory health. Crew members later noted Pacino developing persistent sinus inflammation during the Miami and Los Angeles shoot schedule. Production records and behind-the-scenes accounts describe episodes of nosebleeds and infections that worsened as filming stretched over several months, particularly during heavy harmful substance use montages. The irony is that these scenes were meant to represent collapse and excess, yet the method used to achieve authenticity pushed the lead actor into a similar physical breakdown pattern. By the final stages of production, filming had to be adjusted around his condition and this occupational hazard. Shocking? No. Well, there's more from where that came. Number 17. The scar makeup caused long-term damage. Tony Montana's facial scar is one of the most recognizable visual elements in modern crime cinema, but it came with an unexpected cost. Designed by special effects artist Tom Savini's School of Practical Effects influence, the prosthetic was engineered to stay fixed for extended shooting periods. Instead of being applied and removed daily, it was attached using an industrial-strength medical adhesive to maintain continuity. This created a problem that only became clear over time. Removing the prosthetic required solvents and physical peeling, and repeated removal cycles began affecting the upper skin layers of Al Pacino's face. Makeup supervisors documented increasing redness and irritation along the exact path of the scar, especially during sequences requiring frequent resets, such as the Montana mansion scenes filmed in California interiors. By the end of production, crew accounts suggest the damage had become partially permanent, leaving a faint line that aligned with the character's scar placement. While not a dramatic injury in the medical sense, it demonstrated how practical effects in pre-digital filmmaking often carried physical risk that would be considered unacceptable in modern productions. Moving on, number 16. The chainsaw scene shows nothing. The bathroom chainsaw sequence remains one of the most infamous moments in Scarface, largely because audiences remember far more violence than what is actually shown. Directed by Brian De Palma, the scene nearly triggered an X rating from the Motion Picture Association of America during its 1983 review, primarily due to its perceived intensity rather than explicit imagery. What makes it notable is the construction of violence without visual confirmation. The camera never shows direct chainsaw contact with the victim's body. Instead, De Palma relies on a controlled combination of editing, sound layering, and performance reaction. The chainsaw audio itself was heavily engineered in post-production, blended with animal sound elements to heighten psychological distress. The visual framing cuts away at critical moments, forcing viewers to reconstruct the violence internally. This technique created a paradox for censors. The MPAA struggled to identify any single frame that violated explicit content standards, even while expressing concern. The terror comes from Manny Ray's performance and the confined bathroom setting, which amplifies anticipation rather than gore. Isn't it strange how the absence of explicit imagery can produce a stronger psychological response than graphic depiction? It also demonstrated De Palma's broader stylistic approach in Scarface, where suggestion and timing often carried more weight than visible action, shaping how violence would later be staged for decades. Number 15. Say Hello to My Little Friend was completely improvised. By the time the final act of Scarface unfolds, Tony Montana is no longer operating like a man following a script, on or off screen. During the climactic mansion siege sequence, filmed in Los Angeles in 1983, Al Pacino deviated from the screenplay in one of its most defining moments. The line, "Say hello to my little friend," was not part of Oliver Stone's original draft. It emerged spontaneously during performance. Director Brian De Palma chose to keep the take immediately. That decision became historically significant because the line redefined Tony Montana's final stand as theatrical defiance rather than scripted collapse. Pacino himself later acknowledged in interviews that he does not fully remember constructing the line in the moment. He attributes it to performance adrenaline rather than conscious writing. The impact extended far beyond production. Once released in December 1983, the line became one of the most quoted fragments in crime cinema history, later appearing across music, television, and video game culture. Number 14. The Final Shootout used over 200 explosions on the actor. The final sequence of Scarface was engineered as a controlled demolition of its protagonist. Shot inside a large California mansion set, the climactic battle between Tony Montana and Sosa's assassins required the use of over 200 squibs, small explosive charges designed to simulate bullet impacts on the body. Each squib was individually wired to Al Pacino's costume, creating a system where impact effects had to be precisely timed with choreography and camera movement. The production, filmed over several days in 1983, struggled with the technical limitations of practical effects at the time. Squib malfunctions were frequent. Some detonated prematurely, others failed entirely, forcing repeated resets of blood packs, wardrobe, and lighting continuity. Stunt coordinator Pat Johnson and special effects supervisor Ken Pepe reportedly managed dozens of full resets across multiple shooting days, extending what was originally planned as a shorter sequence into a prolonged logistical operation. At peak intensity, Pacino was covered in layers of artificial blood designed by the makeup team under Tom Berman. Between takes, crew members had to physically clean and reconstruct his costume, a process that could take over an hour per reset, depending on how many charges had been triggered. The result on screen is a continuous descent into physical overload. But behind the camera, it was a fragmented production cycle. Number 13. The mansion already existed as real-life excess. The residence that becomes Tony Montana's empire in Scarface was not constructed as a set. Production designer Ferdinando Scarfiotti selected an existing luxury estate in Montecito, California, built in 1906 to serve as the character's home. The decision was driven by visual necessity. The property already embodied the scale, ornamentation, and spatial excess required to represent harmful substance-era wealth without artificial construction. The estate featured sprawling Mediterranean Revival architecture, large fountains, and highly ornamental interior detailing that required minimal set dressing. Rather than building an environment of excess, the production effectively documented one that already existed, blurring the boundary between cinematic fiction and real-world affluence. Filming on location in 1983 placed the cast inside a structure that visually reinforced the film's central themes of accumulation and instability. During production, crew members later learned that the property was rumored to have historical associations with organized crime figures, though documentation remained anecdotal rather than formally verified. Regardless of accuracy, the association contributed to an atmosphere in which the setting itself felt narratively aligned with Tony Montana's rise. What makes this detail significant is how little modification was required. Unlike studio-built environments, the house dictated camera placement, blocking, and composition. As a result, the fictional world of Tony Montana was partially shaped by a real architectural artifact of American luxury. Also, if you're a Grand Theft Auto fan, yes, Diaz's mansion in GTA Vice City is modeled after Montana's. Number 12. The film was banned and actively blocked by cities. When Scarface moved from production into release planning in late 1983, it entered a political environment as volatile as its on-screen violence. Several U.S. municipalities either restricted screenings or pressured theaters to avoid showing it altogether. The strongest resistance came from Miami, where city officials under Mayor Maurice Ferre expressed concern that the film's depiction of harmful substance cartels and urban violence would damage the city's image at a time when Florida was already under national scrutiny for substance trafficking. Before filming even fully wrapped, Miami authorities attempted to block aspects of production, arguing that the narrative would discourage tourism and reinforce international stereotypes of Cuban exile communities. Law enforcement and city representatives raised objections during location scouting phases in 1982, forcing the production to shift major filming segments to Los Angeles instead of relying heavily on South Florida environments. The attempt to suppress the film had the opposite effect once it was released in December 1983. Instead of fading quietly, the controversy amplified curiosity. In cities where limited screenings occurred, audiences arrived expecting a censored or heavily altered version, only to encounter Brian De Palma's unfiltered presentation. The backlash, intended to contain the film's reach, became one of the earliest accelerants of its cultural afterlife. Number 11. The script was almost a 4-hour chaos draft. The foundation of Scarface began not as a tight crime narrative, but as an oversized political draft, written by Oliver Stone during the early 1980s, a period marked by both Cold War tension and rising harmful substance trafficking routes through Florida. Early screenplay versions stretched close to 4 hours in runtime, if filmed as written, incorporating multiple narrative layers that extended far beyond Tony Montana's rise. These drafts included CIA-linked harmful substance operations, expanded immigration backstories, and political corruption subplots that tied South American regimes to U.S. intelligence agencies. Entire supporting characters were built around these threads, including extended family arcs that explored exile politics and Miami's shifting social structure in greater detail than the final film ever attempted. During production, director Brian De Palma and producer Martin Bregman began trimming the narrative in real time. Script supervisor Betty Griffin documented continuous page revisions arriving on set, often resulting in actors discovering overnight that their scenes had been reduced or eliminated. Some performers arrived for scheduled shooting days only to be told their characters no longer existed in the revised structure. Editor Gerald B. Greenberg later faced the challenge of assembling footage shot under multiple evolving script versions. Of course, none of that is apparent from the flow of the final cut. Number 10. Al Pacino nearly quit the film mid-production. During the filming of Scarface from 1982 to 1983, Al Pacino reached a breaking point. As principal photography progressed, he began questioning whether Tony Montana was too psychologically extreme and morally unrecoverable for mainstream audiences. The character's trajectory, such as unchecked violence, paranoia, and eventual self-destruction, created concern that the role could permanently alter his career trajectory in Hollywood. Producer Martin Bregman later revealed that Pacino seriously considered leaving the project mid-shoot. The film was already deeply invested in location work, practical effects planning, and partial set construction, making a lead actor replacement structurally impractical. Director Brian De Palma intervened during this period, reframing Tony Montana not as a conventional crime protagonist, but as a Shakespearean tragic figure. The comparison to classical tragedy, particularly characters whose ambition drives their destruction, helped reposition the role within Pacino's interpretation. Instead of attempting to humanize Tony, the direction shifted toward embracing his moral collapse. That reframing stabilized production and changed performance tone across the film. Pacino continued with renewed commitment, leaning into a portrayal that emphasized excess, instability, and psychological fragmentation. Number 9. The iconic poster was created before the film existed. Before a single full scene of Scarface was properly assembled, its most enduring image already existed in public circulation. The now iconic visual of Tony Montana in a stark white suit, gripping an M16 rifle, was photographed during a controlled pre-production studio session in 1982. The shoot was conducted by photographer Nancy Ellison, with Al Pacino styled by costume designer Patricia Norris, and props arranged under production oversight to create a deliberate concept image, rather than a frame from the film itself. This image wasn't created as decoration. It was a financing and marketing instrument. Universal Pictures and producers, Martin Bregman and Sidney Sheenberg, used it to pitch the film's tone before audiences had any narrative context. At a stage when the screenplay was still being refined, the visual identity of Tony Montana was already being locked into place. In practical terms, the marketing department effectively defined the film's aesthetic direction before principal photography had fully stabilized. As production moved forward, Brian De Palma and his team had to reverse engineer parts of the film's visual composition to align with an image that already existed in trade circulation. Costume choices, framing, and even set design decisions were influenced by the need to match the pre-sold identity of Tony Montana. Moving on. Number 8. The movie flopped. When Scarface premiered in December 1983, its immediate reception was unstable and sharply divided. Critics in major publications, including Roger Ebert and the New York Times, criticized its runtime, tone, and perceived lack of moral restraint. Ebert, for instance, described it as excessive and emotionally hollow. At the box office, the film opened modestly and failed to meet early commercial expectations despite a wide release. The initial failure was not just financial, but reputational. Industry observers framed it as a miscalculation in tone and scale, especially compared to earlier gangster narratives that had been more restrained in their portrayal of criminal ascent. For a brief period in late 1983 and early 1984, the film appeared destined to fade into the category of high-budget studio disappointments. The turning point came through the home video market, which was rapidly expanding in the mid-1980s. VHS rentals allowed repeated viewing, a critical shift for a film structured around dialogue, heavy scenes, visual symbolism, and layered character descent. Video rental stores in cities like New York and Los Angeles reported unusually high repeat demand by the mid-1980s. This secondary life transformed audience interpretation. Scenes that initially felt excessive in theaters became quotable, mimetic, and culturally portable. By the 1990s, Scarface had evolved into a foundational text within hip-hop culture, referenced by artists such as Nas, Jay-Z, and the Notorious B.I.G., who integrated its themes of ambition, power, and downfall into lyrical narratives. Number 7. The hated synth score that created a future music genre. The sonic identity of Scarface was shaped by composer Giorgio Moroder, an Italian producer already known by 1983 for his work with Donna Summer and for pioneering electronic disco production. For the film, Moroder constructed a fully electronic score built around synthesizers, drum machines, and sequenced patterns rather than traditional orchestral instrumentation. At the time of release, this approach was widely criticized. In the 1983 cinematic context, audiences were still largely accustomed to orchestral scores dominating crime and drama films. Moroder's decision to use synthetic textures created a tonal divide between visual realism and musical abstraction. Critics argued that the music undercut emotional weight, particularly in scenes of violence and psychological collapse. Despite this early rejection, the score was consistently tied to the film's identity. Over time, the perception of the soundtrack shifted dramatically. As electronic music evolved, producers and historians began identifying Moroder's work on Scarface as an early blueprint for what would later become synthwave and retro-futuristic electronic music. Artists such as Kavinsky and later film composers like Cliff Martinez drew inspiration from its combination of analog warmth and digital precision. Music historian Simon Reynolds has noted that this score represents an early intersection between cinematic storytelling and electronic music structure, where repetition, rhythm, and synthetic layering replaced traditional thematic orchestration. What was dismissed in 1983 as overly mechanical eventually became foundational to a genre aesthetic. Number 6. Michelle Pfeiffer's real fear shaped her performance. During the production of Scarface, Michelle Pfeiffer was still early in her feature film career, cast as Elvira Hancock, opposite Al Pacino's volatile Tony Montana. What the camera captures as emotional detachment was, in part, shaped by real on-set uncertainty. Pacino was deep into a method approach throughout filming in Los Angeles and Miami locations. He stayed partially in character between takes and maintained an unpredictable emotional rhythm that shifted from calm focus to explosive intensity without warning. Pfeiffer later described in interviews that she often did not know which version of Pacino would appear on set at any given moment. That inconsistency created a controlled tension in scenes where Elvira is meant to feel emotionally disconnected from Tony. Instead of simulating detachment, she worked from a baseline of real discomfort, reacting to an environment that felt unstable even when cameras were not rolling. Director Brian De Palma and acting coach Peggy Fury helped channel that unease into performance structure rather than removing it. Fury encouraged Pfeiffer to treat emotional distance not as an abstract acting choice, but as a lived reaction. This approach aligned with the film's broader production style, where psychological states on screen often emerged from real friction. The result is visible in Elvira's performance: minimal expressive variation, delayed reactions, and controlled body language that contrasts sharply with Tony Montana's escalating volatility. Number 5. The mother's coldness was sustained off-camera. In Scarface, Tony Montana's relationship with his mother functions as a psychological anchor, but the emotional realism of those scenes was reinforced through an unusual production choice. Miriam Colin, who played Georgina Montana, adopted a deliberate off-camera strategy of emotional distance from Al Pacino during filming. Rather than breaking character between takes, Colin reportedly maintained a cold, disapproving attitude toward Pacino even when cameras were not rolling. This was not a production requirement, but a personal acting decision. The intention was to ensure that every interaction between mother and son carried a consistent undercurrent of disapproval without relying on reset emotional states between takes. This approach created a noticeable atmosphere on set. Assistant director notes from production describe a separation between actors that was intentionally preserved during downtime, particularly during sequences filmed in interior house sets where emotional dialogue scenes were concentrated. Pacino, working within his own immersive method style, responded to this by intensifying Tony's emotional volatility during performance takes. Acting pedagogy at the time, particularly influenced by Stella Adler's school of thought, supported the idea that sustained emotional truth could enhance screen realism. In this case, that philosophy extended beyond the frame itself. Number 4. The World Is Yours blimp. One of the most subtle yet structurally important visual motifs in Scarface is the advertising blimp carrying the slogan, "The world is yours." First introduced through production design by Ferdinando Scarfiotti, the blimp appears repeatedly across Miami skyline shots, office windows, and background frames throughout the film's runtime. Unlike foreground narrative elements, the blimp operates as a persistent environmental presence rather than a direct plot device. Cinematographer John Aguirre Alonso integrated it into compositions so that it often sits outside immediate viewer focus, appearing in reflections, distant aerial shots, or partially obscured skyline views. This technique creates a recurring subconscious visual pattern rather than a traditionally highlighted symbol. Its function evolves alongside Tony Montana's rise. In early sequences, it appears during moments of ambition and upward mobility, visually aligned with his entry into Miami's harmful substance economy in the early 1980s setting. As the narrative progresses toward paranoia and fragmentation, the same object remains visible but increasingly detached from Tony's control. Brian De Palma later described the blimp's presence as a kind of silent commentary on ambition itself, an externalized voice that does not interact with characters but consistently frames their environment. Unlike dialogue or score, it cannot be controlled or confronted. It simply persists, and it found a new life in the 2006 video game Scarface. The World Is Yours. Developed by Radical Entertainment and published by Vivendi Universal Games, this video game actively rewired its ending to keep the universe alive. Instead of treating Tony Montana's mansion shootout as a final collapse, the game introduces an alternate continuity where Tony survives and begins rebuilding his empire from scratch. This structural change is important because it reframes the entire story from tragedy into expansion, letting the character exist beyond the 1983 film's endpoint. The slogan, "The World Is Yours," originally a background blimp advertisement in the film, becomes the central philosophy of the game's design loop. In gameplay terms, it is no longer passive symbolism. It is the actual objective here. The player must take on territories, substance trade, and economic opportunities. As players progress, they literally scale from street-level deals to citywide cartel management, turning the phrase into a measurable gameplay outcome rather than a visual metaphor. Narratively, the game builds on the film's mythos by expanding supporting systems that were only implied in 1983. Miami is reconstructed as an explorable open world divided into districts that mirror real geographic and socio-economic segmentation, where player progression depends on reclaiming influence block by block. The original film's sense of compressed chaos becomes, in the game, a structured empire-building simulation. Voice performance also reinforces continuity. Al Pacino does not return as Tony Montana, but Andre Sogliuzzo provides the voice, carefully modeled to echo the cadence and intensity of the original portrayal without direct imitation. One of the most significant design choices is how failure is handled differently. Where the film ends with irreversible collapse, the game uses failure states as temporary setbacks, reinforcing the idea that ambition is cyclical rather than terminal. And it's a ton of fun, too. If you like the movie and appreciate video games, you'll love this one. Number 3. A real Cuban actor quietly taught everyone authenticity. During the production of Scarface, authenticity in Cuban speech and mannerisms didn't come from dialect coaches alone. It came quietly and consistently from Stephen Bauer, who played Manny Ribera. Born in Havana in 1956, Bauer immigrated to the United States as a child during the wave of Cuban migration that followed the Cuban Revolution. On set, Bauer's lived experience became an informal reference point. While formal dialect coaching was overseen by professionals like Robert Easton, Bauer contributed something less structured but more immediate. Rhythm, slang usage, and emotional cadence rooted in real Cuban-American environments of the 1960s and 1970s. Between takes in Miami and Los Angeles locations, he corrected phrasing and helped calibrate how certain lines should feel, rather than just how they should sound. This created a subtle divide in performance styles. Al Pacino's Tony Montana was intentionally heightened and theatrical, shaped by method acting intensity, while Bauer's Manny carried a grounded realism that reflected lived immigrant experience. That contrast wasn't accidental in effect, even if it wasn't formally designed in pre-production. Director Brian De Palma used that imbalance to sharpen the dynamic between the two characters, especially in scenes where Manny's calm, socially adaptive personality offsets Tony's volatility. Number 2. A future Oscar winner appears for just seconds. Long before international recognition, F. Murray Abraham appeared in Scarface in a role so brief that it lasts only seconds on screen. He is seen as one of the assassins involved in the film's early criminal enforcement sequences, specifically during the execution scene tied to Omar Suarez's storyline. The role is uncredited, in prominence, and visually obscured. At the time of filming in 1982, Abraham was not yet a household name. He was working steadily in theater and supporting film roles, often taking short-term contracts to maintain financial stability in New York's competitive acting landscape. His involvement in the film was a one-day shoot at minimum Screen Actors Guild rates. The trajectory of his career shifted dramatically shortly afterward. In 1984, just 1 year after the release of Scarface, Abraham won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his portrayal of Antonio Salieri in Amadeus, directed by Milos Forman. That performance placed him at the center of global critical recognition, contrasting sharply with his almost invisible presence in the De Palma film. The coincidence created a retrospective point of interest in film history, a future Oscar winner appearing briefly in a movie that would itself grow in cultural significance over time. What was initially a background role became, in hindsight, a documented intersection of two major cinematic trajectories, one evolving into cult status, the other into award-winning prestige within a single production year cycle. This next one will shock you to the core. Number 1. The screenwriter was writing while living the same addiction spiral. The screenplay for Scarface, credited to Oliver Stone, was shaped during a period in which Stone himself was navigating active substance addiction in the early 1980s. At the time, he had already worked on films such as Midnight Express, but his personal life during the transition into the 80s was marked by instability that directly influenced his writing process. Stone has acknowledged in later interviews that the emotional structure of Tony Montana's rise and collapse was informed by his own psychological state during that period. The screenplay reflects patterns of escalating paranoia, heightened ambition, and self-destructive cycles that mirrored lived experience rather than purely fictional construction. Instead of approaching the story from a detached observational perspective, he wrote from within a condition of volatility that shaped tone, pacing, and character intensity. The original drafts contained extensive material that extended beyond Tony Montana's core arc, including political subplots and institutional corruption threads. However, the emotional through line, obsession, excess, and eventual collapse remained consistent across revisions. Director Brian De Palma and producer Martin Bregman later streamlined these drafts during production, but the underlying psychological framing remained intact. Stone's involvement created a feedback loop between lived experience and narrative construction. The script did not simply depict addiction as subject matter. It embedded its structural rhythm within the patterns of instability Stone was experiencing. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.